13,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in a burial cave were already fermenting wild grain. In Bronze Age, Menorca, 3 psychoactive alkaloids survived inside strands of human hair. And high in the Bolivian Andes, a 1,000-year-old ritual pouch preserved traces of substances gathered from several different ecosystems. These discoveries are real, but the stories behind them are not always as simple as they first appear. Some reveal remarkably sophisticated knowledge of plants and chemistry. Others show how easily a beautiful archaeological interpretation can become accepted before the evidence is strong enough to support it. From disputed mushroom figures painted in the Sahara to the oldest known evidence of cereal-based brewing, these are 10 ancient psychoactive discoveries that changed what we know about the past. Number 10. The drugged hair of Bronze Age Menorca. In a cave cut into the Algendar ravine on the Spanish island of Menorca, archaeologists found something that should not have survived for 3,000 years. Strands of human hair. The hair was reddish, carefully cut and stored inside small containers made from wood and antler. Some strands were as long as 13 centimeters. They had not simply fallen from someone's head. They had been deliberately preserved as part of a funerary practice inside the cave of Escarix. The main burial chamber once held the remains of more than 200 people. Yet archaeologists found only 10 hair containers in the concealed collection. That imbalance suggests that the treatment was reserved for selected members of the community. The tested hair came from one compartment of a sophisticated olive wood container with a trilobed boxwood lid. Wear marks show that the lid may have been opened repeatedly. For that reason, the strands might represent one person or more than one individual placed inside during different funerary events. When researchers analyzed one group of strands, they found 3 plant alkaloids locked inside the keratin: atropine, scopolamine, and ephedrine. The findings were published in scientific reports in 2023. The average concentrations were about 8.9 picograms of atropine per milligram of hair, 437 picograms of scopolamine, and 330 picograms of ephedrine. Those numbers are tiny, but chemically, the signal was unmistakable. Atropine and scopolamine occur in plants from the nightshade family, including species such as henbane and mandrake. In sufficient amounts, they can produce confusion, vivid hallucinations, disorientation, and delirium. Ephedrine has a very different effect. It is a stimulant and can occur in ephedra, a plant that grew on Menorca during the period. This matters because chemical residue inside hair is different from residue found in a bowl or jar. A substance in a container may never have entered a human body. A substance incorporated into growing hair shows that one or more people were exposed to it while alive. Human scalp hair grows on average about 1 centimeter each month. Because the tested strands preserved alkaloids along much of their length, the researchers concluded that exposure probably continued for close to a year. That does not tell us the exact dose. It does not prove that the person was repeatedly poisoned. And because the strands had no roots, the researchers could not establish a precise timeline or determine exactly how long before death the substances were consumed. Still, this was not a single accidental encounter with one wild plant. The combination of different alkaloids points to repeated knowledge and use of plants with dramatically different effects. The archaeological context makes the discovery even more intriguing. During a period of social change on Menorca, selected people dyed and cut locks of hair, placed them inside decorated containers, and concealed those containers deep within the cave. The lids carried concentric circles, a design that some researchers have compared to eyes or altered vision. That interpretation remains a possibility, not a proven translation of the symbol. The hair may have belonged to a ritual specialist. The plants may have been used for healing divination ceremony or some combination of those purposes. None of those explanations can be confirmed from chemistry alone. What can be confirmed is already extraordinary. 3,000 years ago, at least one person on Menorca repeatedly consumed preparations containing a stimulant and powerful, mind-altering alkaloids. The community considered selected locks of hair important enough to preserve in carefully made containers. The body is gone. The person's name is gone. But a chemical record of what entered that body remained. Number 9. The Neanderthal flower burial that may never have happened. Shanidar Cave lies in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. During excavations in the 1950s, the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki and his team uncovered the remains of multiple Neanderthals there. One of them became famous around the world. Shanidar 4 was an adult Neanderthal placed in the cave, roughly 65,000 years ago. When the French palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan later studied sediment samples associated with the remains, she found unusual clusters of pollen from flowering plants. Some of those plants, including yarrow, had known medicinal uses in more recent societies. The discovery produced an unforgettable explanation. Perhaps other Neanderthals had gathered flowers and placed them beside the dead. Perhaps the burial showed grief, ritual, compassion, and knowledge of medicinal plants tens of thousands of years before written history. The idea became known as the flower burial. For decades, it appeared in books, classrooms, documentaries, and arguments about whether Neanderthals experienced death as we do. Then researchers returned to the pollen itself. In 2023, a team led by paleoecologist Chris Hunt published a new assessment of the evidence. The researchers noted that solitary bees had nested in the sediments at Shanidar. These insects collect pollen from multiple flowers and concentrate it inside underground nest chambers. That behavior can produce exactly the kind of dense, mixed pollen clusters that originally made the burial seem so unusual. The new study did not prove that every grain of pollen came from bees, nor did it establish precisely when every cluster entered the sediment. Researchers also observed an important botanical problem. The plants represented in individual pollen clumps do not all flower at the same time. A single bouquet made during one burial would therefore be difficult to reconcile with the seasonal pattern. Bees collecting pollen at different times offer a more ordinary explanation. But it showed that flowers deliberately placed on the body were no longer the best explanation for the evidence. The beautiful story had become far more certain than the pollen ever justified. That does not erase evidence that Neanderthals interacted with useful plants. At other sites, researchers have identified plant compounds and microremains in Neanderthal dental calculus. Some may reflect food, environmental exposure, or possible medicinal use. Nor does the pollen debate prove that Neanderthals lacked compassion. At Shanidar itself, injured individuals survived serious trauma, suggesting that other members of their groups may have supported them. Evidence from the cave also continues to inform the debate over deliberate treatment of the dead. Recent work at Shanidar has uncovered additional articulated Neanderthal remains and renewed the case that bodies were intentionally placed in a particular part of the cave. That is a separate question from whether anyone covered Shanidar 4 with flowers. Burial behavior may still be present, even if the famous bouquet is not. But Shanidar 4 cannot honestly be presented as a Neanderthal buried with a collection of medicinal flowers. The larger lesson is more interesting than a simple debunking. Archaeology is not a collection of stories carved permanently into stone, it is a process. New excavations, new microscopes, and new questions can overturn an interpretation that once felt almost perfect. Sometimes the past changes because we discover something new. And sometimes it changes because we finally recognize what the original evidence could never prove. Number 8. The 8,000-year-old coca leaves of Nanchoc Valley. In the Nanchoc Valley of northern Peru, archaeologists excavated the buried floors of early homes built along the western slopes of the Andes. The sites belong to communities living through one of the most important transitions in human history. People in the region were experimenting with cultivation, irrigation, and new forms of settled life. Among the remains, a team led by archaeologist Tom Dillahay recovered 7 desiccated coca leaves. Several appeared, folded or crushed in ways consistent with chewing. Nearby were small pieces and lumps of calcite, containing high concentrations of calcium. That pairing was the crucial clue. Across the Andes, coca leaves have traditionally been chewed with an alkaline substance made from materials such as lime or plant ash. The alkali changes conditions in the mouth and helps release and absorb more of the plant's active alkaloids. Coca leaves can still have an effect without lime, but combining the two makes the process more efficient. Radiocarbon evidence placed the Nanchoc material at about 8,000 calibrated years before present. That makes it the earliest secure archaeological evidence of coca chewing in South America. It is older than writing, older than the pyramids of Giza, and several thousand years older than the first large urban societies in the Andes. The importance of the discovery is not simply that people found a stimulating leaf. Wild plants do not arrive with instructions. Someone had to observe what coca did. Someone had to learn how much to use, how to prepare it, and how an alkaline mineral changed the experience. That knowledge was probably built through repeated experimentation and shared within the community. The Nanchok evidence also suggests that lime production may have involved specialists. Soil chemistry and archaeological features at neighboring sites indicate that people were processing and supplying calcite at roughly the same time that more systematic farming was developing in the valley. The leaves were found in domestic contexts rather than inside an elite palace or monumental temple. That detail matters. It places early coca knowledge within the routines of small communities, not only in the hands of rulers or a formal priesthood. Even the survival of the leaves is unusual. Plant tissue normally decays quickly. Dry conditions, burial, and chance preserved a behavior that otherwise might have disappeared completely, leaving only the processed mineral beside an ancient floor. That does not prove an unbroken coca tradition lasting 8,000 years from one community to the present. Archaeology cannot trace every generation in between. What it does prove is that the central chemical partnership was already known astonishingly early. Coca was not cocaine in the modern sense. Chewing the leaf produces a slower and much milder effect than consuming a purified drug. For Andean, people's coca has also served nutritional, social, medicinal, spiritual, and practical roles, including helping people cope with fatigue and high-altitude environments. Calling it only an ancient intoxicant would miss most of its history. The leaves at Nanchok reveal something larger, complex plant knowledge did not begin with writing formal laboratories or states. It was already being tested beside domestic hearths, preserved in daily habits, and carried in human memory thousands of years before anyone wrote down a formula. Number 7. The invisible beetle habit of prehistoric Thailand. Since 2003, archaeologists working at Nong Ratchawat in central Thailand have uncovered more than 150 human burials. For years, the cemetery offered no obvious evidence of betel nut chewing. There were no clearly identified betel-related tools, no charred areca nuts, and no characteristic black or reddish staining on the teeth of the individual who would later produce the crucial evidence. Then researchers looked inside the dental calculus. Dental calculus is plaque that mineralizes on the teeth during life. Once hardened, it can trap microscopic and chemical traces of substances that entered the mouth. In a study published in 2025, a team led by Piawit Moonkum analyzed 36 calculus samples taken from 6 individuals at Nong Ratchawat. 3 samples produced signals associated with auricalene and aricadine compounds linked to areca nut. The chemical match also required caution. The ancient arecaline-related signal shared the expected molecular weight and formula, although parts of its fragmentation pattern differed from the modern reference standard. The researchers described the result as a diagnostic derivative and supported it with additional instrumental testing. All 3 came from molars belonging to the same person, burial 11, probably a woman between 25 and 35 years old who lived about 4,000 years ago. That made the result the earliest direct biomolecular evidence of betel nut consumption yet identified in Southeast Asia. Only 1 person tested positive. But that does not mean only 1 person at the entire cemetery used areca nut. The study examined 6 individuals, not 36 different skeletons. Preservation, frequency of consumption, the position of the calculus, and cleaning practices can all influence whether a chemical trace survives. The discovery also does not prove that the prehistoric preparation was identical to a modern betel quid. Today, areca nut is often wrapped in betel leaf and combined with slaked lime along with other ingredients that vary by region. The researchers used modern preparations to test their analytical method, but they did not find ancient lime betel leaf or a complete quid in burial 11. Betel preparations can produce stimulation and a feeling of alertness, but their cultural roles extend far beyond that effect. In different communities, they have been used in hospitality, courtship, religious offerings, healing practices, and social gatherings. Long-term use also carries serious health risks, including oral disease and increased cancer risk. Ancient cultural importance and modern medical risk can both be true. The secure conclusion is narrower. This person consumed areca nut probably repeatedly around 4,000 years ago. Even that limited conclusion changes the archaeological picture. Without chemical analysis, burial 11 would have appeared almost silent on this subject. The teeth lacked the staining commonly associated with long-term betel chewing. Her burial was not clearly separated as that of a ruler or ritual specialist. She did have several stone objects, beads, and pottery vessels, but the available evidence does not establish that she held an exceptional social position. The habit survived only as molecules inside mineralized plaque. That raises a powerful question. How many daily behaviors have disappeared from archaeology, simply because they left no large tool, no painted image, and no visible mark on bone? The answer may already be waiting in museum collections. Not in spectacular treasure, but in material so ordinary that earlier generations of researchers rarely thought to test it. Number 6. The herbal wine buried with scorpion 1. At Abydos in Upper Egypt, German archaeologists excavated a massive preternastic tomb known as UJ. It dates to around 3150 BCE, before Egypt was unified under the First Dynasties. The person buried there is often called Scorpion I, although his exact identity and political title remain uncertain. Inside the tomb were ivory labels bearing some of Egypt's earliest known written signs. There were imported goods from the Levant, and there were roughly 700 wine jars. The imported wine itself was evidence of power. Grapes and finished vessels moved through exchange networks connecting the Nile Valley with the southern Levant. Filling a tomb with hundreds of jars meant coordinating production and transport on a scale unavailable to an ordinary household. Together, those vessels may once have held around 4,500 liters of liquid. That is an enormous quantity for one burial. It is closer to the volume of a large hot tub or small plunge pool than a full modern swimming pool, but it still represents a remarkable investment of labor trade and agricultural production. More than 5,000 years later, dark residue remained on some jar interiors. Biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern and his colleagues analyzed that residue. Their results, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2009, identified tartaric acid supporting the presence of grape wine. They also found chemical evidence consistent with tree resin and a range of plant additives. Pine resin was probably used partly as a preservative. Other evidence pointed toward ingredients that may have included coriander balm, mint sage, and related herbs. Figs may also have been added. Some plant identifications are stronger than others. After 5,000 years, chemistry does not always preserve a unique botanical fingerprint. The study therefore presented several herbs as probable or possible ingredients, not a perfectly recovered written recipe. Even with that caution, the discovery is important. Alcohol is an effective solvent. It can extract plant compounds and preserve them in a form that can be swallowed, applied, or stored. Later, Egyptian medical texts repeatedly used wine and beer as carriers for botanical remedies. Resin served more than one possible purpose as well. It could slow spoilage, change flavor, and contribute biologically active compounds. The same ingredient might therefore function as preservative, medicine, and taste at the same time. The Abydos jars show that the underlying practice existed long before those medical papyri were written. But they do not prove that a later physician copied this exact formulation. In fact, no surviving papyrus has yet provided a direct word-for-word match for the mixture inferred from Tomb UJ. We also cannot assume every herb was added solely to treat disease. Some may have contributed flavor preservation, ritual meaning, or several functions at once. For the people who filled the jars, those categories may never have been separate. Food could be medicine. Medicine could be ritual. And wine could carry all three into a tomb. The remarkable part is not that ancient Egyptians possessed a complete version of modern pharmacology. They did not. It is that before the pyramids and before the First Dynasty, people were already combining imported wine, resin fruit, and selected plants in a deliberate preparation. They had learned that a drink could do more than satisfy thirst. 700 jars carried that knowledge into one of Egypt's earliest royal graves. The formula is incomplete. The purpose is not fully recoverable. But the chemistry shows that experimentation with herbal wine had already begun at the threshold of Egyptian history. Number 5. The cannabis smoke of Jerzankal Cemetery. More than 3,000 meters above sea level in the Pamir Mountains of western China lies Jerzankal Cemetery. The site is cold, dry, and exposed to thin mountain air. Its graves marked by circles and bands of stone date to roughly 500 BCE. Reaching the cemetery required movement through a landscape where altitude makes heavy work exhausting. Fuel plants, stone wooden equipment, and participants all had to be brought together for the ceremony. Whatever the smoke meant, the setting shows that it was not treated casually. Inside 8 tombs, archaeologists recovered wooden braziers. Some still held fire-scorched stones. At first glance, the vessels looked like ordinary pieces of funerary equipment. Then researchers tested the charred surfaces. In 2019, a team led by Meng Ren and Yimin Yang published the results in Science Advances. They had extracted organic material from 10 brazier fragments and 4 burned stones. On most of the charred interior samples, they detected cannabinol or CBN. CBN is an oxidation product associated with tetrahydrocannabinol, better known as THC. The researchers also looked at the pattern of cannabinoids and compared it with ancient cannabis from another site. The evidence indicated that cannabis plants with relatively high psychoactive potential had been burned in the braziers. Heated stones were probably placed inside the wooden containers. Cannabis material was then added, producing smoke during mortuary ceremonies. This is among the earliest securely verified chemical evidence for people inhaling cannabis for its psychoactive effects. But one detail needs care. The study did not recover a measured dose of fresh THC from an intact ancient flower, nor did it prove that the people at Yerzon had bred a domesticated high-potency strain in the modern sense. Several explanations remain possible. People may have deliberately selected naturally stronger plants. They may have obtained cannabis through regional exchange. Or environmental stress at high altitude may have encouraged local wild populations to produce different levels of secondary compounds. The researchers could not determine which process was responsible. What the archaeological setting does show is intention. The cannabis was not found in a domestic cooking fire. It appeared inside specialized braziers placed with the dead. The repeated pattern across multiple tombs connects the smoke to funerary activity rather than an isolated accident. The Pamirs were not an empty edge of the ancient world. They stood near corridors later woven into the Silk Roads, where people, animals, technologies, and plants moved between Central South and East Asia. The cemetery predates the fully developed Silk Road system by centuries, so it should not be described as a Silk Road station in the later historical sense. But similarities in burial practices and material culture show that the region was already connected to wider populations across Inner Asia. Yerzon suggests that psychoactive knowledge moved through those landscapes as well. Imagine the ceremony. Wood smolders around heated stones, cannabis smoke gathers near the mourners. Music may have been present. An angular harp was also recovered from the cemetery. Around them, the plateau is cold enough that every breath is visible. We cannot know exactly what participants believed the smoke was doing. It may have altered mourning communication memory, or the perceived boundary between the living and the dead. The chemistry cannot translate the ritual, but it can recover one physical part of the experience. 2,500 years after the fire went out, the wood still preserved the molecular shadow of the smoke. Number 4. The ancient peyote effigies of the Lower Pecos. Along the limestone canyons of the Lower Pecos region near the modern border between Texas and Mexico, dry rock shelters have preserved plant material for thousands of years. Among the artifacts recovered, there were small, rounded objects once described as dried peyote buttons. Closer study revealed something more deliberate. They were not intact cactus crowns. People had processed peyote tissue, mixed it with other plant fibers, and shaped the material by hand into objects resembling the living cactus. The result was not simply stored food or a dried dose, it was an effigy. Chemical testing detected mescaline and other alkaloids associated with peyote. Mescaline can profoundly alter perception, emotion, and the sense of time. But an archaeological concentration inside an effigy cannot reconstruct a user's experience. It tells us what plant material was present, not what every participant felt or believed. Direct radiocarbon dating produced an age of roughly 5,195 radiocarbon years before present. After calibration, the objects are close to 6,000 calendar years old. That distinction matters. Radiocarbon years and calendar years are not identical because the amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere has changed over time. In everyday language, these effigies are often called 5,000-year-old peyote. A more accurate description is that they are about 6,000 calendar years old. Either way, they are astonishingly ancient. They were created long before the pyramids at Giza, and long before writing appeared anywhere in the Americas. The craftsmanship carries as much meaning as the chemistry. Several specimens were made in a comparable way. That repetition suggests a recognized tradition rather than one person's improvised experiment. A shared method of manufacture had already developed around the cactus. Someone did not merely pick a cactus and leave it to dry. The plant was transformed into a representation of itself. That implies a symbolic relationship with peyote extending beyond its immediate physiological effect. Exactly how the effigies were used remains unknown. They may have belonged to a medicine bundle necklace offering or ritual collection. The evidence cannot tell us who made them, what words were spoken around them, or whether the mescaline was consumed during the same event in which the objects were displayed. What the evidence does establish is that peyote already held chemical and symbolic importance in the Lower Pecos thousands of years ago. That history deserves careful language, because peyote is not only an archaeological drug, it remains a sacred medicine in living indigenous traditions, including ceremonies of the Native American Church. Those modern and historical traditions demonstrate the profound religious meaning peyote can carry. However, archaeology cannot prove a single uninterrupted institutional lineage from these particular Lower Pecos effigies to the Native American Church as it exists today. 6,000 years contain migrations, cultural transformations, disrupted communities, and histories that no surviving artifact can fully bridge. The strongest claim is also the most respectful one. Peyote has an extraordinarily deep human history in this landscape. The Lower Pecos effigies show that people were not only using the cactus, but shaping it into ritual material at a time when much of the world still lived without cities or written records. The objects survived because the shelter stayed dry. The experience survived because communities continued to treat the plant as more than an ordinary resource. Number 3. The mushroom-like figures of the Sahara. Tassili Najer rises from southeastern Algeria in a landscape of eroded sandstone towers and rock shelters. Today it stands inside one of the driest regions on Earth. But thousands of years ago, the Sahara was greener. Lakes, grasslands, cattle, giraffes, and hippopotamuses occupied environments that now seem almost impossible. Human communities recorded that changing world on stone. According to UNESCO, Tassili contains more than 15,000 paintings and engravings, spanning from roughly 6000 BCE into the early centuries of the Common Era. Some imagery may be even older, although precise dating of individual paintings remains difficult. Among the most debated images are figures from the so-called Roundhead tradition. The name describes their appearance, not a single known ethnic group. The artist left no written identity, and similar-looking scenes may have been produced across long stretches of time. Treating every Roundhead image as one unified religion would go beyond the evidence. They have large or bulbous heads. Some appear to hold small objects with rounded caps and narrow stems. Fine lines connect certain objects with human figures. To some viewers, the shapes look unmistakably like mushrooms. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Italian ethnomycologist Giorgio Samarini argued that these scenes might depict ritual use of psychoactive fungi. If that interpretation is correct, the paintings could be among the earliest visual suggestions of human interaction with hallucinogenic mushrooms. But this is where certainty ends. Other scholars and observers have interpreted the same shapes as plants, flowers, arrows, ceremonial objects, masks, or abstract symbols. There is no confirmed mushroom tissue from the shelters, no securely identified psilocybin residue, and no inscription explaining what the artists intended to show. Dating is another challenge. Rock paintings cannot always be dated directly. Researchers often rely on style superimposition, environmental context, and comparison with other images. That can provide a broad period, but not an exact year or generation. The greener Sahara makes the mushroom hypothesis ecologically possible. A wetter landscape could have supported fungal species that are uncommon or absent in the same places today. The paintings also document a real environmental transformation. Images of water-dependent animals such as hippopotamuses confirm that the artists inhabited a landscape radically different from the desert visible now. That ecological history is secure even when the meaning of the mushroom-like forms is not. Possible does not mean demonstrated. The imagery is valuable precisely because it sits at the boundary between evidence and interpretation. Unlike the hair from Menorca or the braziers from Girzancal, the Tassili figures contain no direct chemical record of a psychoactive substance. Their place on this list is therefore different. They show how ancient altered states may appear in art and how easily modern expectations can shape what we think we see. Perhaps the figures carried mushrooms. Perhaps they wore masks or held ceremonial plants. Perhaps the shapes represented something for which no modern category is adequate. The paintings remain powerful without pretending that the mystery has been solved. They preserve a visual language from communities whose spoken explanations are lost. We can identify the cattle, wildlife, and changing climate around them. But when those painted hands reach toward a strange, rounded form, archaeology must stop one step before certainty. Number 2. The thousand-year-old ritual bundle of Bolivia. High in the Lipez region of southwestern Bolivia, archaeologists entered a dry rock shelter called Cueva del Chileno. The site lies almost 4,000 meters above sea level in a cold, arid landscape where many tropical psychoactive plants cannot grow. Inside the shelter, researchers recovered an extraordinary ritual collection. There were 2 carved wooden snuffing tablets, a decorated snuffing tube, spatulas made from llama bone, a woven headband, a leather bag, and a pouch made from the snouts of 3 foxes stitched together. Radiocarbon dates placed the assemblage between approximately 905 and 1170 in the Common Era. The dry environment had preserved traces inside the fox snout pouch. Researchers carefully removed a tiny sample and analyzed it with liquid chromatography and tandem mass spectrometry. The results published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019 revealed at least 5 psychoactive compounds: cocaine, benzoylecgonine, a major breakdown product of cocaine, harmine, bufotenine, and dimethyltryptamine, better known as DMT. The analysis also produced a weaker peak, possibly related to psilocin, but that identification was less certain. No single known plant contains the full combination found in the pouch. The evidence therefore points to material from at least 3 plant sources. Likely candidates include coca, an Anadenanthera species, and Banisteriopsis, copy, the vine used in many modern ayahuasca preparations. This was a portable collection of pharmacological knowledge. Some of the required plants grew far from the high-altitude shelter. They had to reach the region through travel or exchange across ecological zones, linking Andean highlands with warmer valleys and tropical lowlands. Coca favors warmer environments. Banisteriopsis copy is associated with humid tropical lowlands. Anadenanthera species also grow outside the cold, high-altitude setting of the shelter. Bringing their products together required knowledge not only of effects but of where valuable plants could be obtained. That does not necessarily mean a single person walked 1,000 kilometers carrying every ingredient. Plants and processed materials can move through networks passing from community to community. The pouch is evidence of connection, but not a surviving map of the route. The co-occurrence of harmine and DMT is especially intriguing. In modern ayahuasca, harmine and related compounds inhibit monoamine oxidase enzymes in the digestive system. That allows orally consumed DMT to remain active for longer than it otherwise would. The Bolivian pouch contained substances associated with both sides of that chemical partnership. But the discovery does not prove that its owner brewed a drink identical to modern ayahuasca. The compounds were recovered from the same pouch, not from a preserved cup of liquid. The equipment includes snuffing tablets and a tube suggesting that at least some preparations may have been inhaled through the nose rather than swallowed. Researchers could not determine whether every substance was combined at once, used separately on different occasions, or mixed in changing recipes. Benzoylecgonine should not be counted as an entirely separate plant drug. It can form when cocaine breaks down. The chemical list is therefore evidence for at least 5 psychoactive compounds, but not necessarily 5 different plant species. The correct conclusion is still remarkable. A ritual specialist possessed several powerful psychoactive plants drawn from different environments. The collection included a possible combination resembling the pharmacological foundation of ayahuasca, but its exact preparation remains unknown. This was not laboratory chemistry expressed in modern molecular language. It was empirical knowledge. People observed plants, effects, preparation methods, and interactions. They preserved successful practices through teaching and ritual rather than chemical diagrams. That kind of knowledge can be highly sophisticated without being identical to modern science. The person who used the bundle may have been a healer diviner or another kind of ritual practitioner. Archaeologists often use the word shaman, but no written record from the owner explains the role. The objects themselves carry the strongest evidence. Tools for preparing and inhaling powders. A carefully made animal snout pouch. and a chemical mixture assembled through connections across some of South America's most demanding terrain. The bundle does not reveal exactly what its owner saw or believed. It reveals something more secure, a network of botanical knowledge capable of bringing distant plants together in one specialist's hands. Number 1. The beer brewed before agriculture. At Rakefet Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel, near modern Haifa, Natufian hunter-gatherers buried their dead between roughly 13,700 and 11,700 calibrated years before present. The cave floor contains around 100 carved mortars and cut marks. These were permanent features made by communities living before the full development of agriculture in the region. In 2018, a team led by Li Lu examined 3 of the stone mortars using residue analysis, microscopic study, experimental brewing, and evidence of wear. Inside, they found starch granules from plants including wheat or barley, oats, legumes, and other local resources. Some starches showed damage consistent with malting and fermentation. The process would have required several steps. First, wild grain was soaked and allowed to germinate. Then it was dried. Next, it was crushed and mixed with water. Finally, the mash was heated and fermented into a beverage. The result was probably not clear carbonated beer, like a modern commercial lager. It may have been a thick, cloudy gruel with a relatively low and variable alcohol content. But the manufacturing sequence was intentional, technically demanding and recognizable as cereal-based brewing. At about 13,000 years old, the Rakefet evidence is the earliest widely accepted archaeological evidence of its kind. It predates fully domesticated cereals in the Near East by several thousand years. The people who made it were foragers. They gathered wild plants, hunted animals, and lived in communities that were becoming increasingly settled, but had not yet built an agricultural state. Calling them hunter-gatherers does not mean they wandered constantly or lacked complex technology. Natufian groups built substantial settlements, used intensive plant processing equipment, created cemeteries, and returned to important places over generations. Rakefet fits that world of increasing permanence before domesticated farming became dominant. The location adds another layer. These mortars were found in a cave used as a cemetery. Other evidence from Natufian burial sites shows communal feasting around the dead. At Rakefet, the fermented drink was probably prepared for gatherings connected with mortuary ritual remembrance and social bonds. Beer was not simply a way to get drunk. It carried calories, it transformed grain, it required planning and cooperation. And in a ritual setting, it could help turn a collection of individuals into a community sharing the same emotional event. This discovery gave new energy to an old idea often summarized as beer before bread. Perhaps the desire to produce fermented drinks helped motivate people to gather, manage, and eventually cultivate cereal grasses. That remains a hypothesis. Rakefet does not prove that alcohol invented farming. It does not prove that 3 mortars caused the rise of cities, property, government warfare, or empire. Bread-like foods were already being prepared elsewhere in the region before the Rakefet brewing evidence. The same wild grains could serve many purposes, and researchers have suggested that bread making and brewing may have developed together. There is also scholarly debate over how confidently microscopic starch damage can distinguish brewing from other forms of heating and processing. Lu and her colleagues defended their interpretation through experiments, use-where context, and several lines of residue evidence. The brewing conclusion is influential, but it is still an archaeological reconstruction rather than a preserved liquid tested for alcohol. Climate change, population pressure, food security ritual obligations, and social competition may all have influenced the long transition toward cultivation. There was probably no single cause. Yet the beer hypothesis no longer sounds like a joke. For generations, explanations of agriculture emphasized hunger and survival. People supposedly cultivated grain because they needed a more dependable source of food. Rakefet reminds us that human beings do not reorganize their lives for calories alone. We gather for funerals. We prepare difficult foods for ceremonies. We invest time in tastes, sensations, memories, and relationships that cannot be reduced to simple nutrition. If fermented grain played even a supporting role in the transition toward cultivation, then one of humanity's greatest transformations was driven partly by social desire as well as biological need. That is a more convincing idea than a single dramatic cause. Early agriculture emerged over centuries through countless local decisions. A community could value grain because it made bread, porridge, stored food, and fermented drink all at once. Ritual demand may have added one more reason to gather larger quantities and return to the same plants each year. That possibility is powerful enough without claiming that beer single-handedly invented civilization. 13,000 years ago, people carried wild grain into a burial cave. They soaked it, germinated it, crushed it, heated it, and waited for microbes they could not see to transform it. Then they gathered near their dead and shared the result. The mortars remain in the cave floor. Their makers left no recipe and no explanation. But the starch trapped in stone preserves one moment when food, chemistry, grief, and community became part of the same human experience. And that may be the most important discovery on this list. Ancient psychoactive substances were never only about intoxication. They could be medicine, sacrament, social technology, trade goods, symbols or tools for confronting pain and death. The evidence is sometimes chemical and direct. Sometimes it is visual and deeply uncertain. The challenge is to keep the story compelling without claiming more than the evidence can carry. Because the real past is strange enough. It does not need to be exaggerated. If you want to explore more discoveries that changed what we know about ancient history, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.